My sister's wedding planner handed me the contract with a nervous smile, clearly recognizing my name but unsure how to handle the situation. Ms. Thompson, your family is requesting to cancel their booking due to personal circumstances. I looked at the signature on the contract, my own mother's, for the venue they'd specifically chosen while deliberately excluding me from the wedding, never realizing that the Thompson Estate Events they'd fallen in love with belonged to the daughter they'd written off as a failure. My name is Sarah Thompson, and this is the story of how my family spent 10 years treating me like their biggest disappointment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, until they accidentally tried to hire me for the wedding I wasn't invited to. It's a story about assumptions, exclusion, and the moment when family hypocrisy collided with business ownership in the most spectacular way possible. When I came home from my final deployment in Afghanistan, my family had already written the narrative of my future. I was 28, single, and apparently destined for struggle in their eyes. My older brother Michael had just been promoted to senior partner at his accounting firm. My younger sister Jennifer was engaged to a successful real estate developer, and I was the family question mark who'd chosen military service over the stable civilian path they'd mapped out for me. The transition is always hard, my mother said when I told them I was planning to start my own business. Her tone carried that particular mix of concern and skepticism that parents use when they think their children are making poor decisions but don't want to say so directly. Maybe you should consider something more secure. Jennifer's fiancé knows people in corporate security. Good benefits, steady income. My father was more blunt. Starting a business is risky, Sarah, especially when you don't have experience in the civilian market. The military doesn't really prepare you for entrepreneurship. He said it like entrepreneurship was a disease I might catch if I wasn't careful, something that would inevitably lead to financial ruin and family embarrassment. But I had a vision that they couldn't understand. During my service, I'd coordinated logistics for events ranging from diplomatic receptions to base ceremonies, managing everything from catering to security for gatherings of hundreds of people. I'd seen how poor planning could turn important events into disasters, and how excellent execution could create moments that people remembered for the rest of their lives. I wanted to bring that precision and attention to detail to civilian event planning, specifically focusing on weddings and corporate retreats. The property I'd found was perfect, a 150-acre estate 40 minutes outside the city, complete with a historic mansion, formal gardens, and enough open space to accommodate large outdoor celebrations. It had been on the market for 2 years because the previous owners had let it deteriorate, but I could see the potential that others missed. With my military background in project management and my savings from 6 years of combat pay, I had both the skills and the capital to restore it properly. My family's reaction to the purchase was a mixture of bewilderment and barely concealed horror. They'd gathered at my parents' house for what I thought would be a celebration of my new venture, but instead felt like an intervention for someone making catastrophically poor life choices. A wedding venue? Jennifer repeated, as if I'd announced plans to become a circus performer. Sarah, do you have any idea how competitive that industry is? How much work is involved in running events? Not to mention the liability issues, Michael added, his accountant brain immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. One accident, one food poisoning incident, one drunk guest injury, and you could lose everything. My mother tried to be supportive, but her version of support felt more like consolation. Well, if it doesn't work out, you can always sell the property. Real estate is usually a safe investment, even if the business fails. They spoke about my venture like it was already doomed, an expensive lesson I needed to learn before accepting the reality that I wasn't cut out for business ownership. In their minds, I was a former soldier trying to play entrepreneur, destined to fail because I lacked the proper civilian credentials and business experience. For the next 5 years, as I built Thompson Estate Events into one of the most sought-after wedding venues in the region, my family treated my success like a temporary stroke of luck, rather than the result of skill, determination, and extremely hard work. They attended exactly 0 of my events, never referred friends or colleagues to my business, and continued to describe my career in vague terms that suggested they were embarrassed by my choice to work in what they considered the frivolous wedding industry. The exclusion from Jennifer's wedding was just the culmination of years of being treated like the family member, whose choices were too unconventional to fully embrace or support. Michael and Jennifer weren't just successful. They were the kind of successful that made my parents' social media accounts look like professional achievement showcases. Every family gathering became an opportunity to celebrate their latest accomplishments, while my business was treated like a quirky hobby that might eventually lead to something more respectable. Michael's accounting firm had grown from a small local practice to a regional powerhouse, handling corporate clients across 3 states. He'd been featured in business magazines, spoke at professional conferences, and had recently been elected to the Chamber of Commerce board. His wife Laura was equally impressive, a marketing executive who'd built her own consulting company. Together, they lived in a sprawling suburban mansion, drove luxury cars, and sent their twin daughters to private schools that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Jennifer's trajectory was equally golden in my parents' eyes. Her engagement to David Hartwell had been treated like a royal wedding announcement. David owned one of the largest real estate development companies in the region, with projects ranging from luxury condominiums to commercial shopping centers. His family was prominent in local society, the kind of people who appeared in newspaper social pages and donated wings to hospitals. Jennifer worked as his company's interior design director, a position that allowed her to showcase her creativity while building a Peggy and Siad's impressive portfolio of high-end projects. The family values they celebrated were crystal clear: traditional success metrics, recognizable career paths, and social status that could be easily explained and admired. Michael's accounting expertise was respectable and profitable. Jennifer's design work was creative but grounded in a legitimate business framework. Their achievements came with clear prestige markers: awards, media coverage, professional recognition, and most importantly, the kind of income that allowed them to live lifestyles my parents could boast about to their friends. At every family gathering, Michael and Jennifer held court, like visiting celebrities. Michael would share stories about landing major corporate clients and expanding into new markets. Jennifer would show off photos from her latest luxury home renovation projects and talk about meeting with celebrity clients. Their success was quantifiable, impressive, and socially valuable in ways that made my parents beam with pride. The contrast with how they treated my business was stark and deliberate. While Michael's financial achievements were celebrated with champagne toasts, my profitable venue operations were dismissed as seasonal work. While Jennifer's design projects were shared proudly on social media, my award-winning wedding exhibitions were never mentioned in family conversations. While their professional milestones were remembered and referenced for years, my business accomplishments were forgotten almost immediately after being reluctantly acknowledged. My parents had developed specific language patterns that reinforced the hierarchy. Michael was our son, the successful accountant, and Jennifer was our daughter, the talented designer. I was just Sarah, who runs that event space outside town. The difference in terminology was subtle but unmistakable. Their careers were professional achievements. Mine was just something I did. Family photos told the story most clearly. Michael and Jennifer were featured prominently in formal portraits displayed throughout my parents' house, often in professional attire that emphasized their business success. Their awards, diplomas, and media clippings were framed and exhibited like trophies. My military service photo had been relegated to a side table, and despite Thompson Estate Events being featured in multiple wedding magazines and regional business publications, none of those accolades were displayed anywhere in my parents' home. The exclusion extended to their social circles as well. My parents regularly brought Michael and Jennifer to country club events, business networking functions, and community fundraisers, where their successful children could be showcased to friends and colleagues. I was never invited to these gatherings, ostensibly because my schedule was too unpredictable, but really because my career didn't fit the image they wanted to project. Even their retirement planning reflected the hierarchy. Michael was consulted about investment strategies and financial planning because his accounting background made him the family's trusted advisor. Jennifer's opinions on home renovations and property values were sought and followed. My expertise in project management, vendor coordination, and event logistics was never considered relevant to family decisions, despite requiring many of the same organizational skills they admired in my siblings' work. The message was unmistakable. Some types of success counted, and others were just expensive hobbies that might eventually lead to real careers. But there were inconsistencies in my family's narrative about my struggling event business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That should have raised questions if anyone had been paying attention. Small details that didn't quite match their assumptions about my financial situation or professional standing. Signs that suggested Thompson Estate Events was more successful than they'd ever bothered to investigate, like the way I dressed for family gatherings. While they assumed I was barely breaking even in the competitive event industry, I wore designer clothes and jewelry that clearly cost more than someone running a failing business could afford. When my mother occasionally commented on my outfits, she'd make remarks like, "You've always been good at finding bargains," or, "It's nice that you treat yourself sometimes," never considering that my wardrobe might actually reflect the income of a successful business owner, rather than careful shopping on a tight budget. There were the cars, too. I'd upgraded from my military-issued vehicle to a luxury SUV, then to a high-end sedan. But my family absorbed these changes without questioning how someone with a supposedly struggling venue business could afford such vehicles. My father once joked that I must have gotten military financing deals, completely missing the obvious explanation that my business was generating enough profit to support substantial purchases. My living situation should have been another clue. While they assumed I was probably renting a modest apartment somewhere near the venue to keep costs down, I'd actually purchased a custom-built home on 30 acres adjacent to the estate property. When I'd mentioned buying a house, my mother had asked if I'd gotten a good deal on a fixer-upper, never imagining that I'd commissioned an architect and built exactly what I wanted from the ground up. The travel was particularly telling. I frequently took what I called research trips to scout other venues, attend industry conferences, and meet with potential vendors. These trips took me to resort destinations, luxury hotels, and exclusive events across the country and internationally. But my family filed these under business expenses in their minds, assuming I was probably staying in budget hotels and attending free seminars, rather than recognizing that successful venue owners regularly invest significant money in professional development and competitive research. Even my casual mentions of business metrics should have raised flags. When conversation occasionally turned to my work, I'd reference booking numbers, revenue figures, and client satisfaction scores that didn't match their assumptions about a struggling small business. But they'd nod politely and change the subject, apparently assuming I was either exaggerating or that they didn't understand the event industry well enough to interpret what I was telling them. The most obvious inconsistency was my availability for family events. While they expected someone running a failing business to be constantly stressed about money and desperately pursuing every potential client, I regularly turned down bookings that conflicted with family obligations. I'd block out weekends for family weddings, holiday gatherings, and vacation trips without apparent concern about lost revenue. This flexibility should have suggested that my business was successful enough that I could afford to be selective about clients, but they interpreted it as evidence that I wasn't serious enough about making money. My professional network provided constant clues that went unnoticed. When we'd run into people at restaurants or community events, there was often immediate recognition and respect that didn't match my family's narrative about my modest local business. Wedding vendors, caterers, florists, and photographers would approach me with the kind of deference typically reserved for industry leaders. But my parents would dismiss these interactions as normal networking rather than recognizing the professional status they implied. Even my insurance and legal requirements should have been telling. I'd mentioned needing to update liability policies, work with entertainment lawyers, and coordinate with local authorities for large events. These aren't the concerns of someone running a small, struggling venue. They're the professional requirements of someone managing significant operations that affect hundreds of people and generate substantial revenue streams. The technology investments were another missed signal. I'd upgraded to sophisticated event management software, professional lighting and sound systems, and digital marketing platforms that required significant upfront costs and ongoing subscription fees. Someone barely keeping a small business afloat doesn't typically invest heavily in cutting-edge technology unless the return on investment justifies the expense. But perhaps the most telling sign was how completely uninterested they were in actually visiting Thompson Estate Events, despite it being less than an hour from their home. What my family never knew was that Thompson Estate Events had become one of the most exclusive and profitable wedding venues in the tri-state region. Within 3 years of opening, we were booked solid 18 months in advance, commanding premium prices that placed us among the top luxury venues in the area. The struggling business they imagined was actually generating annual revenues that exceeded both Michael's accounting firm and David's individual real estate projects. My military background hadn't been a detour from business success. It had been the foundation for it. The logistics coordination skills I'd developed managing supply chains for forward operating bases translated perfectly into orchestrating complex wedding events, where timing, vendor coordination, and crisis management were critical. The leadership experience I'd gained commanding diverse teams under pressure made managing event staff, dealing with demanding clients, and coordinating multiple vendors feel routine rather than overwhelming. The attention to detail that had kept soldiers alive in combat zones now ensured that every wedding at Thompson Estate was executed flawlessly. I approached each event like a military operation, with detailed timelines, backup plans for every possible contingency, and communication protocols that kept everyone synchronized throughout the day. Brides quickly learned that booking with us meant their wedding would run with precision that other venues simply couldn't match. But the real secret of our success was the property itself, and the vision I'd had for transforming it. The 150-acre estate included not just the restored mansion, but also formal gardens, a lake with a gazebo, multiple ceremony sites, and enough flexibility to accommodate everything from intimate gatherings of 50 to elaborate celebrations of 300 guests. We'd invested heavily in infrastructure, professional kitchens, climate-controlled bridal suites, advanced lighting and sound systems, and landscape design that created natural photo opportunities throughout the property. The business model was sophisticated and deliberately exclusive. Rather than competing on price, we competed on experience and quality. Our packages started at $25,000 and went up to $75,000 for premium weekend bookings, prices that reflected the level of service and attention we provided. We handled everything: catering, flowers, photography coordination, transportation, accommodations for out-of-town guests, making the planning process seamless for clients who valued convenience and quality over cost savings. Our client base was exactly the demographic my family moved in, but somehow never connected to my business. Corporate executives, medical professionals, successful entrepreneurs, and established family money. People who wanted their wedding to be perfect and had the resources to ensure it happened. We regularly hosted events for clients who'd been featured in business magazines, whose weddings were covered in society pages, and whose guest lists included local celebrities and political figures. The wedding industry recognition had been swift and comprehensive. Thompson Estate Events had been featured in multiple national wedding magazines, won regional awards for excellence, and been included in exclusive vendor networks that connected us with top-tier planners and suppliers. We'd hosted showcase events for wedding professionals, served as a preferred venue for luxury wedding planners, and built relationships with vendors who reserved their best work for our clients. My personal involvement went far beyond what typical venue owners provided. I personally met with every bride and groom, walked them through customization options, and remained available throughout their planning process. On wedding days, I was present from setup through breakdown, ensuring that every detail met our standards and that any problems were solved invisibly before they could affect the celebration. This level of personal attention was part of our brand and a key reason why our referral rate was nearly 90%. The financial success had been remarkable and rapid. After covering the initial property investment and renovation costs, the business had generated enough profit to allow me to expand the property, invest in additional amenities, and build a substantial reserve fund. I'd also been able to diversify into corporate retreats and charity galas, which provided revenue during traditionally slower periods, and connected us with even more high-profile clients. The staff I'd assembled reflected the quality of operation we'd built. Our head chef had trained at culinary institutes and worked in Michelin-starred restaurants. Our event coordinators had backgrounds with luxury hotels and high-end catering companies. Our groundskeeping and maintenance teams were professionals who understood that our property's appearance was crucial to our reputation. The isolation that came with my family's dismissal of my career was deeper and more painful than they could have imagined. Every day I made decisions that affected dozens of people's most important life moments, but I couldn't share that responsibility or satisfaction with the people who should have been my closest support system. Building a successful business while being treated like a family disappointment created a loneliness that even my military service hadn't prepared me for. The secrecy wasn't entirely my choice. Running a luxury venue meant maintaining discretion about high-profile clients, many of whom valued privacy above all else. When we hosted weddings for local political families or celebrities, I couldn't share those experiences even if I'd wanted to. The confidentiality requirements of luxury event planning meant that some of my most impressive professional achievements had to remain completely private, known only to the clients and vendors who'd witnessed them firsthand. But the deeper cost was emotional and personal. When a bride's father thanked me with tears in his eyes for creating the perfect wedding for his daughter, I couldn't call my mother to share that meaningful moment. When regional magazines featured Thompson Estate Events as one of the premier venues in the state, I celebrated alone because my family would have assumed I was exaggerating my involvement or the significance of the recognition. The pressure of maintaining perfect execution was constant and unrelenting. Unlike other businesses where mistakes might result in lost profits or dissatisfied customers, errors in wedding planning could destroy once-in-a-lifetime moments that could never be repeated or repaired. Every decision I made, from vendor selection to timeline coordination, carried the weight of knowing that hundreds of guests and 2 families were depending on everything going perfectly. The physical demands were exhausting in ways that my family never understood. Wedding weekends required me to be on site for 12 to 14 hours, coordinating setup, managing vendors, solving problems, and ensuring that every moment unfolded seamlessly. During peak season, I might work 6 consecutive weekend events, each requiring the same level of intensive coordination and personal oversight. The recovery time between events was minimal, and the emotional energy required to maintain enthusiasm and attention to detail for each couple was substantial. My military experience had taught me to function under pressure and manage complex operations, but civilian event planning brought different stresses. In combat, problems were solved with available resources, and acceptable losses were part of mission planning. In wedding coordination, there were no acceptable losses. Every detail had to be perfect, every timeline had to be met, and every guest experience had to exceed expectations. The margin for error was 0, and the consequences of failure were measured in ruined relationships and lifetime disappointments. The financial investment had been enormous and risky in ways my family never recognized. Beyond the initial property purchase and renovation costs, maintaining a luxury venue required constant reinvestment in property improvements, equipment upgrades, and staff training. Weather damage, equipment failures, and changing client expectations meant that significant portions of revenue went back into maintaining the standards that commanded premium pricing. Personal relationships suffered under the demands of the business and my family's dismissive attitude. Dating was complicated by unpredictable schedules and the emotional energy required for weekend events. Friends from my military service understood professional commitment but were scattered across the country pursuing their own careers. Building new relationships in the civilian world was challenging when my family's lack of support made me reluctant to share details about work that dominated my life. The success also brought unexpected isolation within the wedding industry itself. Other venue owners often treated me with suspicion or resentment, assuming that my military background and business success meant I didn't understand the traditional relationship-based aspects of wedding planning. Some vendors and planners initially doubted whether someone with a combat background could handle the emotional nuances of wedding coordination, though those concerns typically disappeared after working their first event with us. Most painfully, I couldn't honor my military service the way I wanted to. The leadership skills, crisis management abilities, and logistical expertise I'd developed in Afghanistan were directly responsible for Thompson Estate Events' success. But my family saw no connection between my military experience and business achievement. They dismissed both my service and my career, never understanding that they were part of the same story of commitment, excellence, and service to others. For 5 years after opening Thompson Estate Events, my family's misconceptions about my business became increasingly elaborate and entrenched. What had started as assumptions about my financial struggles evolved into a complex narrative about my life that bore no resemblance to reality, but which they repeated with such confidence that even I sometimes wondered if they were deliberately ignoring obvious evidence. My mother had developed a particular expertise in explaining away my apparent success to her social circle. When friends complimented my car or commented on my clothes, she'd respond with elaborate theories about military benefits, veteran business loans, or inheritance money from our grandfather that I'd supposedly used to fund my little event business. She spoke about my venue the way other parents might discuss their adult children's expensive hobbies, indulgent but unsustainable projects that were probably costing more than they earned. "Sarah's always been creative," she'd tell neighbors who asked about my work, the word creative carrying undertones of impracticality and financial irresponsibility. "She's trying to make that old estate into something profitable, but you know how expensive those restoration projects can be." When someone mentioned seeing Thompson Estate Events featured in wedding magazines, my mother would nod knowingly and suggest that I'd probably paid for promotional coverage, rather than earned legitimate recognition. My father's dismissiveness was more direct but equally misguided. At his weekly gatherings with other retirees, he'd listen to proud stories about successful children and respond with resigned comments about my, quote, expensive experiment with event planning. "Some people have to learn the hard way that small businesses are risky," he'd say, as if my 5 years of consistent profitability were just a lucky streak that would inevitably end in failure. The family gatherings became exercises in elaborate fiction, where my siblings' measurable achievements dominated conversations while my career was relegated to polite inquiries that nobody expected serious answers to. Michael would spend extensive time describing his firm's expansion plans and new client acquisitions, complete with revenue projections and strategic analysis. Jennifer would share detailed updates about her latest luxury design projects, showing photos and discussing celebrity clients. Meanwhile, my work was summarized as keeping busy with weddings or staying involved with that venue project. Even extended family members had absorbed and amplified these misconceptions. My cousin David, who worked in commercial real estate, would regularly offer unsolicited advice about the challenges of maintaining large properties and the difficulties of making event venues profitable. "The overhead on those old estates is brutal," he'd tell anyone who'd listen, speaking about my business with the authority of someone who'd clearly never examined the actual financial performance of Thompson Estate Events. Uncle Robert, who owned a small manufacturing company, had appointed himself as the family expert on my business challenges. He'd corner me at family gatherings to share warnings about seasonal businesses, the problems with depending on discretionary spending, and the importance of having backup plans when passion projects failed to generate sustainable income. His advice was delivered with the condescending kindness typically reserved for family members who were clearly headed for financial disaster. The most frustrating aspect was how they interpreted evidence that contradicted their assumptions. When I'd mentioned being fully booked months in advance, they'd nod sympathetically about the stress of trying to fill dates, and suggest that I might be taking on too much work out of financial desperation. When I discussed expanding the property or adding amenities, they'd exchange worried glances about overextending myself financially and taking on debt I couldn't afford. Social media provided a constant source of cognitive dissonance that they resolved through increasingly creative explanations. My professional photography of the estate, coverage in luxury wedding publications, and testimonials from satisfied clients were all dismissed as marketing efforts that probably cost more than they generated in business. When Thompson Estate Events won regional awards or was featured in national magazines, my family scrolled past without recognition, apparently assuming that legitimate business success would be more obvious and measurable than what they were seeing. The community had largely absorbed their narrative, treating me with the mixture of sympathy and admiration typically reserved for people pursuing noble but financially unrealistic dreams. Neighbors would ask gentle questions about whether the venue was doing well enough to sustain itself, as if Thompson Estate Events were a charity project rather than a profitable business enterprise. The wedding planning for Jennifer and David began 18 months before their chosen date, and from the very beginning, I understood that I wouldn't be part of it. Not as a sister, not as a family member, and certainly not as a professional whose expertise might be valuable. The message was delivered through careful omissions rather than direct confrontation. Conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, planning sessions I wasn't invited to, decisions made in family meetings where my presence was somehow never convenient. The initial venue selection process was particularly telling. Jennifer and my mother spent months touring locations throughout the region, documenting their visits with photos and detailed reviews that they shared enthusiastically with Michael and other family members. They visited country clubs, historic mansions, resort properties, and exclusive estates, creating elaborate spreadsheets comparing amenities, pricing, and availability. Thompson Estate Events was never mentioned as a possibility, despite being exactly the type of luxury venue they were seeking and less than an hour from our family home. When I finally asked my mother directly whether they'd considered my venue, her response was a masterpiece of diplomatic dismissal. "Oh, sweetie, we wouldn't want to put that kind of pressure on you," she said, as if hosting my sister's wedding would be a burden rather than an honor. Wedding planning is so stressful, and mixing family with business is always complicated. We want you to just enjoy the day as Jennifer's sister. The subtext was unmistakable. They didn't trust my venue to meet their standards for Jennifer's special day. Despite having never visited Thompson Estate Events, never seen our facilities, and never inquired about our capabilities, they determined that my business wasn't suitable for their family's most important celebration. The exclusion extended beyond just venue selection. Wedding planning conversations happened around me but never included me, even when they involved logistics, vendor coordination, and event management, areas where my professional expertise was directly relevant. Jennifer would spend hours on the phone with wedding planners, discussing timeline coordination and crisis management strategies, while I sat nearby knowing I could solve most of their concerns with a single conversation based on 5 years of hands-on experience. The guest list discussions were equally painful. I watched them debate invitations, meal preferences, and seating arrangements for hundreds of people, while understanding that my own attendance was apparently still a question mark. When Jennifer mentioned needing help with coordination and family logistics, my mother suggested hiring additional wedding planning services rather than asking whether I might contribute my professional skills to ensure everything ran smoothly. The breaking point was building through a series of small incidents that accumulated into something much larger. Family dinners where wedding details dominated conversations I wasn't part of. Shopping trips for wedding dress appointments and vendor meetings where my presence was never suggested. Planning retreats where my mother, Jennifer, and future mother-in-law made major decisions about every aspect of the celebration, except whether to include the sister who understood better than anyone how to make large events successful. 2 months before the wedding, they finally announced their venue selection, Rosewood Manor, a historic estate about 90 minutes from the city that commanded premium pricing for exclusive events. The announcement was made at a family dinner, where they shared photos of the property, detailed descriptions of the amenities, and enthusiastic praise for the venue's reputation and service quality. Everything they described about Rosewood Manor, the historic architecture, the manicured gardens, the attention to detail, the exclusive clientele, was exactly what Thompson Estate Events provided, often at higher standards and more competitive pricing. But they'd never bothered to discover that, never visited my property, never asked about what I'd built over the past 5 years. Sitting at that dinner table listening to them praise another venue for qualities that my business had been recognized for nationally, I realized that the exclusion wasn't about protecting family relationships or avoiding business complications. It was about their fundamental inability to see me as successful, professional, or capable of meeting their standards for something that mattered to them. The wedding planning process had become a 1.5-year demonstration of everything my family believed about my life and career, played out in real time through decisions that revealed their true assessment of my professional worth. The moment of truth came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 6 weeks before Jennifer's wedding date. I was in my office at Thompson Estate Events, reviewing contracts for our upcoming spring season, when my wedding planner, Amanda Richardson, knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and barely contained amusement. "Sarah," she said, holding a familiar-looking folder, "we have a situation that I'm not quite sure how to handle professionally." She placed the folder on my desk, and I immediately recognized the Thompson Estate Events logo on the cover. Inside was a complete wedding package proposal for Jennifer Thompson and David Hartwell, scheduled for the exact date I knew they'd booked at Rosewood Manor. The contract was comprehensive, detailing everything from ceremony setup to reception coordination, with pricing that fell well within their stated budget range. The bride's mother, Linda Thompson, called yesterday requesting an emergency consultation, Amanda explained, her voice carefully neutral. Apparently, Rosewood Manor had a catastrophic kitchen fire last week, and they're going to be closed for renovations through the summer. The family is desperate to find a replacement venue that can accommodate their guest list and match their quality expectations on 6 weeks' notice. I stared at the paperwork, processing the magnitude of the irony. After 18 months of planning a wedding that deliberately excluded me, my family was now sitting in Thompson Estate Events consultation room, having no idea they were asking the sister they'd dismissed to save Jennifer's wedding day. They specifically requested our premium package, Amanda continued, and they were willing to pay our emergency booking surcharge for the short notice. Mrs. Thompson was quite complimentary about our facilities and reputation. She mentioned that Thompson Estate Events came highly recommended by several people in their social circle. The recommended by their social circle detail was particularly rich. For 5 years, my family had treated my business like an embarrassing hobby, while their friends and neighbors were apparently impressed enough to refer major events to us. They'd been dismissing exactly the kind of professional success that their own social network valued and respected. "There's one more thing," Amanda said, her professionalism slipping slightly to reveal genuine bewilderment. When I asked Mrs. Thompson about family connections to the venue, she said they didn't have any. She specifically mentioned that the bride's sister works in some kind of government filing job and wouldn't be involved in the wedding planning. Government filing job. Even in their moment of crisis, asking for help from the business they'd never bothered to acknowledge, my mother was still describing my career as paperwork processing rather than the successful venue operation they were literally sitting inside. I looked through the contract details, noting that they'd requested every premium service we offered: the maximum guest capacity, upgraded catering options, extended venue access, and comprehensive coordination services. The total package price was $68,000, more than many people's annual salaries, being paid by the family who thought my business was too risky and unstable to support basic living expenses. "How would you like me to handle the follow-up consultation?" Amanda asked. "They're expecting a call this afternoon to discuss final details and contract signing." The decision tree was complex and emotionally loaded. I could approve the booking and let my family discover my involvement on their wedding day. I could have Amanda handle everything without revealing my ownership until after the event. I could decline the booking and force them to find yet another last-minute solution. Or I could take the call myself and let the revelation happen in real time, over the phone, while they were still dependent on my goodwill for their daughter's wedding. "I'll take the call," I decided. "Schedule it for 2 o'clock this afternoon. And Amanda, make sure you mention that the venue owner will be personally handling their account, given the complexity of the emergency rebooking." The irony was perfect and devastating. The family who'd spent years questioning my business judgment was about to discover that their daughter's wedding could only be saved by the sister they'd decided wasn't successful enough to include in their celebration. In 6 hours, 18 months of assumptions about my life and career were going to collide with the reality of what I'd actually built. The phone call at 2 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon was one of the most extraordinary conversations of my life. I sat in my office, looking out at the gardens where hundreds of couples had celebrated their weddings, and dialed my mother's number with a mixture of anticipation and dread that I'd never experienced in any business negotiation. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Sarah Thompson, owner of Thompson Estate Events. I understand you're interested in booking our venue for your daughter's wedding." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that I initially thought the call had dropped. Then I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like papers shuffling and a chair scraping across the floor. "Sarah?" she said finally, her voice carrying a confusion so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Sarah, is this some kind of mistake? Amanda said we were speaking with the venue owner." "You are speaking with the venue owner," I replied calmly. "I've owned and operated Thompson Estate Events for 5 years. I understand you're looking for an emergency venue change due to the Rosewood Manor situation." What followed was a silence that stretched long enough for me to hear my mother calling my father's name in the background, her voice tight with something between panic and disbelief. I could hear muffled conversation, Jennifer's voice joining the discussion, and then my father's voice much closer to the phone. "Sarah, what exactly is going on here?" he demanded, his tone carrying the authority he'd used when I was 16 and had violated curfew. "Are you working for this venue company now?" "I own this venue company, Dad. I built Thompson Estate Events from the ground up. The property, the business, the reputation, all of it. You're calling me because you need my venue to save Jennifer's wedding." The impact was immediate and devastating. I could hear Jennifer's voice rising in the background, asking questions that my parents couldn't answer. The family who'd spent 18 months planning a wedding without me had suddenly discovered that their only viable option was entirely dependent on my cooperation and goodwill. But my mother started, then stopped, clearly struggling to reconcile 5 years of assumptions with the reality of what I was telling her. "But you said you worked in event planning. You never said you owned—" "I said I started a wedding venue business," I corrected. "You decided that meant I was struggling with a small operation that probably wasn't profitable. You never asked for details, never visited the property, never showed any interest in what I'd actually built." The conversation that followed was painful and revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents tried to process how the daughter they'd written off as financially unsuccessful was now in the position of potentially saving their other daughter's wedding. Jennifer got on the phone, her voice shaking as she realized the sister she'd excluded from her wedding planning was the only person who could make her celebration possible. "Sarah, I had no idea," Jennifer said, and for the first time in months, her voice carried genuine emotion rather than polite distance. "When Mom said Thompson Estate Events, I never connected it to— we never knew you owned." "You never asked," I said simply. In 18 months of wedding planning, no one ever asked about my business, my property, or whether I might be able to help with your celebration. The desperation became more apparent as the reality of their situation sank in. 6 weeks before the wedding, with 300 invited guests, deposits paid to vendors, and a celebration that had been planned down to the smallest detail, they were entirely dependent on a venue owned by the family member they'd deliberately excluded from the process. "Can you accommodate our guest list?" my father asked, his voice suddenly formal and careful, as if he were negotiating with a stranger rather than his daughter. "We can accommodate up to 350 guests," I replied. "According to the contract proposal Amanda prepared, you're planning for 280. That's well within our capacity." "And the catering? The timeline? The coordination services?" Jennifer's voice was tight with anxiety about whether her perfect wedding could be recreated on such short notice. "We can handle everything," I assured her. "The question is whether you want me to." The hours that followed that phone call were unlike anything my family had ever experienced together. For the first time in years, they needed something from me. Not polite acceptance of their assumptions, not quiet endurance of their dismissiveness, but actual professional services that only I could provide. The power dynamic that had defined our relationships for 5 years was completely reversed, and none of us were prepared for how that would feel. My mother was the first to arrive at Thompson Estate Events, driving up the winding road to the main house with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and something that looked like grief. She walked through the restored mansion, the formal gardens, and the event spaces, with the careful attention of someone seeing her daughter's life clearly for the first time. "Sarah," she said finally, stopping in the main ballroom where crystal chandeliers reflected afternoon sunlight off polished floors. "This is extraordinary. How did we not know? How did we never ask to see what you'd built?" The question hung in the air because we both knew the answer. They'd never asked because they'd never believed there was anything worth seeing. They'd constructed such a complete narrative about my struggling business that actually visiting would have threatened assumptions they weren't ready to challenge. Jennifer and David arrived an hour later, and I watched my sister's face as she took in the property that would now host her wedding. The venues they'd spent months comparing to Rosewood Manor couldn't match what Thompson Estate Events offered, not in terms of beauty, amenities, or service quality. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that their emergency solution was actually an upgrade from their original choice. "I can't believe this is what you do," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and shame. "When you talked about event planning, I don't know what I pictured, not this." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had as a family. For the first time, they asked real questions about my business. How I'd financed the property acquisition, what the renovation process had involved, how I'd built our reputation and client base. They wanted to understand not just what I'd achieved, but how I'd achieved it, while they were assuming I was struggling. Asha base. My father struggled the most with the revelation. The military prepared you for this, he said, walking through our commercial kitchen and coordination offices. The logistics, the management, the attention to detail. We never made that connection. You never wanted to make that connection, I replied. Military service didn't fit your idea of what success should look like, so you dismissed both my service and anything that came from it. But the most difficult conversation was about the wedding itself and what my exclusion had really meant. Jennifer broke down completely when she realized that 18 months of wedding planning had been designed around avoiding the one person who could have made her celebration everything she wanted it to be. I was so proud of finding Rosewood Manor, she admitted through tears. I kept thinking about how sophisticated and exclusive it was, how impressed everyone would be. But you had something better all along, and I never even looked. The accusations of cruelty came later, when the emotional impact of their discovery had time to settle. Some extended family members suggested I was being manipulative by not revealing my ownership earlier. Others questioned whether I should have been more direct about my success instead of allowing their assumptions to continue unchallenged. But the truth was simpler and more painful than manipulation. I'd gotten tired of being dismissed and had stopped trying to correct their misunderstandings. When they showed no interest in my actual life and career, I'd stopped offering information they clearly didn't want. The wedding itself became a celebration transformed by understanding, rather than ruined by revelation. Jennifer's day was everything she'd hoped for, executed with the precision and attention to detail that had made Thompson Estate Events successful. But more importantly, it was the first family event where my professional achievements were acknowledged and respected rather than politely ignored. The relationships that emerged from that weekend were different, not instantly healed, but honest in ways they'd never been before. My family finally understood what I'd built, and why I'd built it. The assumptions that had defined our interactions for years were replaced by curiosity, respect, and the recognition that success takes many forms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.